technical crew has exorcised the hobgoblins from the video equipment, I guess we're ready to begin. It is my pleasure today to present to most of you, or at least to a good number of you, our newest colleague in the psychology department, Dr. Rebecca Gomez. Dr. Gomez has spent a good part of her academic career in the Southwest of the United States. She got her undergraduate and graduate degrees from New Mexico State University. And during that time, she was the recipient of a number of fellowships, including one from NASA and one from NSF. During that time, she also did some very interesting work looking at transfer of learning, and that's where she first became interested in the topic of artificial grammars, a topic that she started studying with adults. But then, when she moved on to do a postdoc at University of Arizona with Luann Gherkin, she began to address the same questions with infants. And in fact, really, at that time, nobody had even begun to think about the possibility that one could do artificial grammar learning experiments with infants, whether it was possible or not to do this with infants. And she and Luann Gherkin showed that we could do this with 13-month-old infants and got some very interesting results that were published in Cognition. And she also has published a recent paper in Trends in Cognitive Science that describes a lot of the work in this area. And is certainly one of the leading researchers looking at these kinds of topics and very interested in the whole issue of how infants transfer information learned in one context to another context. So I think I'll stop there, not take up any more of her time, and let her explain to you what she does. Rebecca?
Thank you, Peter. That was a really nice introduction. So just to let you know, I think that this talk will take about an hour without questions. So that you won't, I mean, if you think it's going to take 45 minutes, you might start squirming in your seats at that point. But if you know it's going to take an hour, then you'll be able to adjust to that. So I'm going to be talking about artificial language learning and language acquisition. We know that all normally developing children acquire language. The real mystery is how they do this in such a short period of time. So how is it that they go from where they're at birth to where they're at 2 or 3 years of age? And I'm going to sort of set up this discussion in terms of two sort of extreme views of the language learning problem. According to the nativist view, the assumption is that and this is actually the view that's predominated in the last 30 years or so. So according to this view, what learners acquire, their target is an idealized grammar. Another assumption is that the input is impoverished and the learning mechanisms are rudimentary. Given these assumptions, how do you explain how learners converge on the ideal grammar? Well, the only recourse left to them is to assume that infants are born with domain-specific or language-specific rules. Sort of on the other end of the spectrum, we've got the learning theorists, and there's been a real sort of, this view is becoming repopularized, so it's gaining in popularity now. And the learning theorists really question a lot of these basic assumptions. So instead of assuming that what learners acquire is an idealized grammar, they want to say that perhaps what learners acquire is an approximate grammar. So in fact, Mark Seidenberg has been talking about this for some time now. He points to the kinds of information people tend to respond to in language processing tasks. They tend to respond to statistical regularities. And so he wants to argue on that basis that perhaps what we're processing is an approximate grammar rather than an idealized grammar. We might also question the assumption of how impoverished the input is. In fact, analyses of large-scale corpora, I've been talking to many of you about these types of things today, show that language is in fact rich in statistical cues. We might also question the assumption of whether the learning mechanisms are rudimentary. So we know by now that connectionist models have had a great deal of success using associative techniques in modeling very complex learning situations. And we might also, from this point of view, question whether the initial state involves domain-specific knowledge. The learning theorists tend to argue that the types of mechanisms learners use are ones they can use in all sorts of domains. Now, I will tell you that I'm a real optimist when it comes to learning. After studying learning for so many years, I'm constantly amazed at how powerful human learning is. But there clearly are hereditary components to language acquisition. So we've got things like critical periods. We know that it's harder for an adult to learn a second language than it is for a child, for example. And we know that there are hereditary components to language impairment. So we know that specific language for impairment has a huge hereditary component. So I think for me, the question is trying to understand the relative contributions of innate knowledge and the environment. Now, in recent years, there has been, most of the focus on learning has been with computational models, but in recent years there's been sort of a lot of attention paid to learning in infants. So much of this work has actually been conducted by Peter Jusek here. So he's actually done a lot of work showing that infants are sensitive to, he and his students and colleagues, that infants are sensitive to the structure of language long before they ever begin to say their first words. So we know that infants have these sensitivities. I'm going to be talking about a technique that will actually supplement these types of approaches. So I use artificial languages because I think it gives me some control that you don't always get in natural language studies. And I think you can use these two approaches to really converge on the learning mechanisms. So for example, in natural language, we know there are lots of correlated cues. So when you show that an infant is discriminating some language form, we don't always know why, right? We don't always know which of the cues is that they're discriminating. So I can use these artificial languages to have more control over the input. I can also control for prior learning. So they've never heard these artificial languages. So that it helps me get at the issue of exactly what they can learn at different points in development. And so what I'd like to sort of argue in general is that I think we can use these methods to gain a more precise understanding of the learner. And I think having a better understanding of the learner will actually inform our language acquisition theories. Because as you can see, we've really tended to underestimate the learner. And so I think actually being able to sort out the language problem, we'll be able to do that better if we can actually characterize the learner. So I'm going to address a number of issues. I'm going to talk about, and forgive me, those of you who have heard me talk about this before, but I want to just go ahead and, what I want to impress you with are the remarkable learning abilities that infants have. So I'm going to talk about their ability to acquire complex word order. I'm going to talk about rudimentary abstraction abilities. I'm going to talk about their ability to abstract syntactic categories, and I'm going to talk about their ability to detect frequent patterns in their input and what the mechanisms might be driving that. So we know that sensitivity to the order of linguistic units is fundamental in all theories of language acquisition and in theories of language modeling, right, as we've talked about. So can 12-month-olds acquire complex word order? So we want to know whether they'll learn sequential dependencies even when words occur in variable positions in sequence. That's what I mean by complex word order. So in any language, for example, words, you can have the word the occur in multiple positions in sequence, in English, for example. But we also want to know whether infants will generalize to sequences they've never heard before. So I'm going to give you a natural language example of how I go about these types of studies. So in these particular studies, I expose learners to a finite state language. And this isn't, of course, the formal notation. It's just a notation I use because it's easy to understand. So essentially what you do is you start at the leftmost point and you traverse the states in the direction of the arrows to produce grammatical sentences. So by using this, you can produce a sentence like the boy raced the girl to the pond, or the girl quickly raced the boy. So you can expose learners to a subset of sentences from your finite state grammar, and then you can test them to see whether they'll distinguish new sentences. So sentences like the girl raced the boy from the raced girl the boy. Okay? So how do we actually do this with artificial languages? Well, we use two grammar designs where we expose infants to one of two grammars. Grammars begin and end with the same words, and they contain the same vocabulary, but they differ in terms of internal word order. So that this grammar, this transition, rud, jik, would not have occurred in the other grammar, but both grammars begin with vot and pel. Okay, so an example of a grammatical sentence here is vot, rud, jik, or pel, rud, jik, vot, rud. The methodology we use is the head term preference procedure, where you've got an infant in a three-sided test booth sitting on the mother's lap, and you have a flashing light in front of the infant and flashing lights on either side of the infant, and you've got speakers also on either side of the infant. You start a trial by flashing the light directly in front of the infant. When the infant fixates, you then start flashing the light on whichever side is going to be the source of sound. As soon as the infant looks toward the source of sound, you start playing the language sample. And you essentially measure how long the infant pays attention to the sample. Okay, so that's the methodology. And importantly, infants control the amount of exposure to the language samples. So here's an example trial. It sounds like vot, jik, rud, tam. Pel, tam, pel, jik. Pel, tam, jik, rud, tam, rud. So literally nonsense, okay? And the procedure involves a brief exposure period followed by a 5-minute play break, because these infants, if you don't give them a break, in some of these studies they start screaming, and we don't want them to do that. And then they get 8 test trials, where 4 of the trials are new grammatical strings they haven't heard before, and 4 of the trials come from the other grammar. So what do we find? Well, I've got, and all my graphs for the infant studies are going to be like this. We have mean listening time on the y-axis, and we have their training grammar on the x-axis. And you can see that infants trained on grammar 1 listen longer to grammar 1 strings than grammar 2 strings, and vice versa for the other grammar. Infants trained on grammar 2 listen longer to grammar 2 test strings than to grammar 1 test strings. Now this is remarkable because infants only listened about 2 minutes to these samples. And so after 2 minutes of exposure, they were able to learn something about how words should be ordered so that they could actually recognize new strings compared to ungrammatical strings. And one thing I forgot to point out is that the strings actually are very complex in the sense that words can occur in multiple positions in sequence. So the word pel can occur in the first position, the middle position, or later on, or they can occur multiple times. So there's a lot of complexity in this. So we were really excited about this finding. And then we wanted to go on to ask whether infants could actually abstract beyond specific word order. So one convenient feature of these grammars is that you can instantiate them in any vocabulary. So you can actually train learners in one vocabulary, and then you can keep all of the sort of constraints on how words can be ordered in terms of keeping the underlying structure, but you can instantiate the test items in another vocabulary. Okay, so we use this type of methodology, but why would we want to do this? Well, because we know that language learning involves the ability to abstract beyond the ordering of specific words. That's why we can recognize sentences we've never heard before, or even utter sentences we've never heard before. So we're trying to tap into some of these abstraction abilities. So again, we investigated these abilities by training infants in one vocabulary and testing them in new vocabulary. And the reasoning is that successful transfers would demonstrate that they have abstracted beyond the specific word order. Okay, so if they can actually recognize new grammatical strings and new vocabulary, then they've learned something about the constraints on how things can be ordered, but it's more abstract than specific words. By the way, if you have questions at any point about some of the logic, go ahead and step in, because sometimes it could be just a very small clarification that I can add. So how do we achieve this mapping? Well, you could train infants in the vocabulary jed, fem, tup, dak, sog, and then at tests you can map every occurrence of jed to vot, of fem to pel, of tup to jik, and so on. So that's how we change vocabulary. So a string in the training grammar would be fem, sog, fem, fem, tup, but in the test grammar would be pel, tam, pel, pel, jik. Now this example is a little misleading because, in fact, we don't use the same strings in training and test. They might be exposed to something like fem, sog, fem, tup during training, and they transfer to something like fem, pel, tam, pel, pel, jik. Okay, so what do we find? Well, in fact, they can do this. Okay, again, after just a couple of minutes exposure, they can abstract beyond the specific word order so that they can still recognize strings from their training grammar even though these strings are new, and they'll listen to those longer than to strings from the other grammar. So we were really excited about this. But given that infants show this ability, what can we say about the nature of their learning, right? Well, in fact, it turns out there's been a huge battle between the nativists and the connectionists over this very issue. Not in particular our study, but this issue of transfer. And so there are connectionists who have implemented models of this kind of learning, and there's Gary Marcus, who's been arguing that what learners abstract are algebra-like rules. And why would he say this? Well, one thing you probably noticed about these strings is that they have patterns of repeating elements, so pel, tam, pel, pel, jik. He actually manipulated this in a series of studies, and he wanted to make the claim that infants were acquiring rules. I think that's a pretty strong claim. I think what they're probably acquiring are patterns. But I think we need, I guess I'd like to make the point that I still think it's an important demonstration. It's important to demonstrate that infants can show some abstraction. But after we've demonstrated this, we need to go on to ask how relevant this is for language acquisition. So I don't think it is. Even though I think it was important to demonstrate, I don't think it's particularly relevant for language acquisition. So let me say what I think the limitations are of this type of abstraction. So again, his argument is that when an infant abstracts an ABA pattern, if you expose them to wo, fe, wo, we, di, li, pi, po, pi, he wants to say that they're treating the first and the third element as variables, and so anything can go there. And so he wants to say that's an instance of rule abstraction. And he furthermore wants to relate that to language. Well, here's the real problem with this. The way to think of it is in terms of a comparison between ABA and the noun-verb-noun pattern we find in many English sentences. So abstracting ABA from ba, po, ba involves simply noting that the first and third element are physically identical, okay? But we've got a very different thing when we're talking about noun, verb, noun, because just look at a sentence like John loves books. John and books are not physically similar, right? They're the same category, they're both nouns, but they're not physically similar, so we've got very different types of operations here. So that's our real criticism of this type of claim, that we don't think these determinations involve anything more than perceptual identity. And so what we'd like to say is that this type of abstraction is at least one step removed from the physical stimulus, right? Because there's no similarity between John and books. But in the case of ABA, you're just doing a match based on perceptual similarity. Okay, so you don't really have the kind of abstraction that you need for language acquisition. Okay, is that clear? Okay, so how might you want to study abstraction in language learning? Well, one way you might do this is by looking at how learners acquire something like syntactic categories. So we know this is a fundamental ability, and it's fundamental to linguistic productivity, because any learner who can identify a novel word like wug as a noun knows that they have immediate access to all of the rules implied by that category, right? So if you can identify something as a verb, you have access to all of the rules that are implied by verbness. And so understanding how learners form these categories is really central, we think, to understanding what it means to acquire language, because it's central to productivity. Let me show you the approach that we've used. This is some work I'm doing with Luann Gherkin. This is an approach we've used to study categories and category relations. So what we do is we expose learners to category relations like AX and BY. And sentences can take the form AX BY or BY AX. And what we do is we expose them to most but not all of the pairings to see whether they'll discriminate A1X4. So see, they've never seen this instance. Will they discriminate A1X4, which is grammatical, from A1Y4? Okay? If they've learned something about how categories pattern relative to each other, they should be able to do this. So let me give you a concrete example that will make this more clear. Okay, so here we've got determiners patterning with nouns, and we've got this other pattern down here. So we want to expose learners to most but not all of the pairings, and we want them to then know that the boy is grammatical, but the run is not. Well, that's a bad example, actually. We want them to know that a shoe is grammatical, but can shoe is not. Okay. So it turns out that this structure is extremely difficult for learners to acquire. We spent about a year piloting studies before we found out that other people had worked on this problem also. And I've got those people listed up here. And we were really surprised by this. We really thought that people could learn these kinds of associations, but in fact, it turns out they can only abstract when there's some kind of similarity structure built into your categories. So let me give you an example of this. This is a study that Frigo and McDonald did, where the task was for learners to learn to greet people in a novel culture. So you greet people differently depending on their social class. So people in class 1 get greeted with jad and quon, depending on time of day, and people in class 2 get greeted with foith and moop. And what you see here is that you can distinguish these classes based on these cues. So class 1 names take the form one ursamglot, one nenuglot, one olifglot, one autoglot. So they begin with one and end with glot. And you've got very different perceptual features in the category 2 names. And in fact, if you separate the categories in this way, learners can acquire, they can do this category-based abstraction, and they can even do it for words that don't have the cues. What these asterisks mean are these were the pairs that were left out. So wanenuglot might have been paired with jad, but not with quon. Okay? So you have to build similarity structure in to get this type of abstraction, which is actually pretty interesting because there have been all these criticisms of learning points of view based on the assumption that there's no way to constrain learners. Well, in fact, learners are constrained, right? They won't form associations willy-nilly. So now we've begun to do these studies with pre-verbal infants, and this is sort of a preliminary version of category-based abstraction, where what we expose learners to, the features here are 2-syllable words versus 1-syllable words. So they have to learn to associate ush and alt with 2-syllableness, and ong and erd with 1-syllableness. So we train them up on a bunch of these combinations, and then we look to see if they'll be able to generalize to new 2- and 1-syllable words, okay, with these pairings. And what do we find? Well, there's some preliminary evidence they can do this. So if you look at mean looking time again, they show a preference for their training grammar, although the effect is mainly carried in grammar 2. So there might be some problem with the materials here, and we're working on it because we're not getting the learning is not as robust for grammar 1. So there is some evidence that they're capable of these rudimentary abstraction abilities. So I guess one point I want to make is that essentially this raises sort of it sort of causes us to question some of our basic assumptions about how learners bootstrap into categories. So a predominant view has been that learners start with meaning, and that they can use meaning to learn syntactic categories. And in fact, if we can show, we haven't actually shown it conclusively, but if we can at some point show that learners can learn these syntactic categories, then you can imagine it really simplifies the learning problem, right? So if you've got the semantic information and the syntactic information, it's going to be easier to make the mapping, I think. So I think it'll change the way that we view this problem of how learners acquire syntactic categories. Okay. Another thing you can ask about this kind of learning is whether it can be accomplished with limited exposure. So we know, for example, I mean, logically speaking, 3-year-olds are not exposed to as much of the human language as adults are, right? And yet they show these generalizations. So you want to show that learners can actually generalize from limited input. And I actually have done some studies along these lines. I think I'll explain the logic, but I'll just sort of skip over the actual studies so I can get on to the thing that I'm most excited about. But you can actually put learners in different types of learning situations where you either expose them to a lot of different exemplars from their learning space, or you expose them to a small number of exemplars, and you look to see whether they'll learn just as well on exposure to a few exemplars. So you can use that as a way of looking to see whether they can generalize from limited exposure. I see a lot of squinted eyes as if this logic is escaping. So does anybody have any questions about this before I go on? Okay, so in essence, you just look to see whether learners can generalize as well based on a subset of the learning space rather than to a lot of different exemplars. And in fact, I've done some studies with the Frigo and McDonald materials. I'll just say this briefly so you have a concrete example where I either expose learners to the whole, most of the set, or I cut down the number of exemplars. And I find that they generalize just as well. These are adult learners, okay? Okay, so now we get to go on to the thing that I'm most excited about now. So, I have to tell you I may have to tell you what these studies tell us. I think they tell us a couple of important things. One is that humans are not unconstrained learners. I mentioned this already. So we know from these studies that learners will not generalize, that human learners will not generalize any association. You need to build correlational structure in to get them to do this. But these studies also show the presence of powerful induction abilities. Okay, so here's the thing I'm most excited about. The question of whether frequent patterns can aid learning, and if so, under what conditions. So we've been looking at invariant structure in language, and in fact, learning accounts of language acquisition rely heavily on patterns that occur frequently. So these are patterns involving, say, agreement between auxiliaries and verb inflections, like is running. That would signal that the thing in the middle is a verb. Or determiners signaling noun phrases. So you know that if the is paired with a word, can also go with that word. And the idea has been around in the literature for some time now that these kinds of regularities might act as anchors for signaling syntactic structure. But do they really aid learning? And if they do, how do they do that? So one idea is that perhaps these regularities are more, this is actually my idea, perhaps these regularities are more likely to be perceived as invariant because they occur in variable contexts, right? Well, in fact, what you can notice about these things is that these frequently occurring patterns involving function morphemes like determiners, auxiliaries, inflections, these tend to be drawn from the set of closed class elements. This set is small relative to the open class elements, so that the things that occur around them are drawn from this infinite set. So the question is whether this variability actually helps with the perception of the structure that doesn't, in a sense, change. So to what extent does variability of context impact learning of the invariant structure? So here's the method I used. And the first set of studies I'll talk about are ones I've done with adults. So I exposed adults to one of two grammars. In these grammars, sentences all contain 3 words, and what learners have to acquire is the dependency between the first and the third element. And you can see that learners can't use conditional probabilities between adjacent elements because these occur in both grammars. So XF occurs in both grammars. So you can't use adjacent elements, any knowledge about adjacent elements. The only way you can distinguish sentences in these 2 grammars is based on the dependency between the first and the third element. So in this case, C predicts F, but in grammar 2, C predicts D. Okay? So you can see that these dependencies are different. So in grammar 1, A predicts D, but in grammar 2, A predicts E, and so on. So that's just repeating what I said. Okay, so I forgot to mention what role X plays. It turns out X is what we vary. So what we vary is the size of the pool from which we draw the X element. So learners are in one of 4 conditions. Imagine, or the way the figures work out, if you have to learn 3 dependencies, and those can be drawn from a pool of 2 elements, in fact, you only have to learn 6 strings, right? But as you increase the number of irrelevant intervening elements, the problem becomes computationally more difficult, so that with a set size of 24, you actually have to remember 72 strings. So it's a much more difficult learning problem. And let me give you an example of what the acquisition was like. We exposed learners to about 18 minutes of sentences from their grammars, and they sounded like Vot Wadam Jik, Dak Benez Tud, Vot Kumo Jik, Pel Kaisi Rud, Dak Hiftum Tud. This is enough to drive anybody nuts after 18 minutes. And then we tested learners for memory of old strings and also whether they could generalize to new strings. So just to give you a sense of how difficult these discriminations are to make, this would be the memory test, and these are the items that adults actually get on this memory test. So adults trained on grammar 1 would have to distinguish, for example, Vot Wadam Jik from Pel Wadam Jik, right? So these are very subtle discriminations we're asking people to make. And in fact, we're always amazed that people can do this. But people who have been in these studies tell us that in some of the conditions, these dependencies actually pop out for them perceptually. And with the generalization case, we just included completely new words. So what did we find? So what I've got plotted here are essentially hits minus false alarms. So I looked at the endorsement rates to grammatical items minus the endorsement rates to non-grammatical items. So this is a different score. And so what you see is that performance is pretty much the same. And in fact, this is just moderate. This is performance on the order of, say, 55 or 60% accuracy if you're just looking at percentage correct. So they perform fairly moderately until you get to the largest set size where, boom, all of a sudden it's as if they've had a qualitative shift in their learning. Now, I don't think there's necessarily anything special about the number 24. I think if you looked at set sizes in between, you'd actually see some improvement in learning. But what's so amazing about this and so counterintuitive is that it's the very largest set size that learners actually do best on. So it's as if this variability, once it gets to be enough, it really pops learners into a different mode. And so just to give you a sense of what these numbers mean, this score would reflect, say, a subject saying, yes, it's grammatical to 6 of the grammatical strings, and yes, it's grammatical to 5 of the non-grammatical strings, right? So that's not very good accuracy. But what we've got here is a subject saying, yes, it's grammatical for all 6 strings, and yes, it's grammatical for only 1 ungrammatical string. So we've got much better discrimination. And in fact, we get the same pattern for generalization, which is pretty neat. And then we also ask people to tell us whether they noticed any patterns. And what you find is that people in the smaller set sizes, if we score this in terms of the proportion of participants who can report all 3 dependencies, you can see it's only a small proportion with the small set sizes, but with the large set size, it's up at 80%. Right? So it's quite high. So there are a large proportion of people who can actually report the rule, which is really amazing. And in fact, people report to us that in this condition, the dependency just pops out for them perceptually. Okay, so let me just summarize this adult learning. Essentially, we wanted to manipulate the variability of the set size, of the size of the pool from which we drew the irrelevant intervening elements. And what we found was that sensitivity to the invariant structure to these long-distance dependencies increased dramatically with a large enough set size. And again, I mean, these findings are really counterintuitive given that the performance is best in the condition with the largest memory demands. Okay, so, but what we really want to know is whether infants can do this, right? So, will infants also show this sensitivity? And we were, in fact, Peter and Lynn Santelman had actually looked at some of this kind of learning in natural language. So they showed that by 18 months, infants could distinguish is running from can running. So that, but at 12 months, they can't do this. So that gave us some lead in terms of which age groups to pick. So we actually chose to test we actually expected to see a similar age pattern with the similar aged infants, but with our artificial language materials. So we simplified the grammar. We used 17-month-olds and 12-month-olds. We simplified the grammar so that they just had to learn 2 dependencies instead of 3. And we just manipulated the set size to consist of 12 or 18, okay? And so what did we find? Oh, I have to tell you, acquisition only lasts for 3 minutes in these studies. So if we find discrimination, it's really going to be amazing. And it's even more amazing when, again, you look at these strings. So, and infants have to distinguish, you know, sets of strings like vot kaisi jik, pel puser rud, vot vami jik, pel wadam rud, from vot kaisi rud. So see, the discrimination between vot kaisi jik and vot kaisi rud is really subtle, right? I think this is a really hard problem. What do we find? Well, sure enough, like the infants in Peter and Lynn's study, the 12-month-olds don't do the discrimination. But they do when they're 17 months of age. So they don't do the discrimination for the smaller set size, much like the adults, but they do it with a large enough set size. And I feel confident about these results because we've been able to replicate them. So we've used 18-month-olds and we've used a set size of 24, and we've been able to replicate the basic finding. So we do show discrimination. So this is pretty exciting to me anyway. So in summary, the 17-month-olds will detect the invariant structure when the set size is sufficiently large, but not when it's smaller. But the 12-month-olds can't do this. And it's nice that these results converge with those found in natural language, because one thing people ask you when you do these kinds of studies is, how do you know this has anything to do with language acquisition? And up to now, it's been sort of hard to say, yes, this does, but if we can find similar age patterns, then that suggests that we are tapping into the same types of mechanisms. And I think we don't know the answer yet about the mechanism completely. I'd be really surprised if 12-month-olds cannot detect invariant structure. I think this must be one of those abilities we're born with. It may just be, like Santelman and Jusic argued, that, and this is consistent with some of Alyssa Newport's ideas, that the 18-month-olds have a wider processing window. We don't know that from these studies, but we can begin to look at that. And so Jill Laney is actually going to be putting together a study where we speed up the sequences, so we make them shorter. So we make the processing window shorter and see if the 12-month-olds will be able to do this. She's also going to do some studies with younger learners trying to get at invariance detection. So you can imagine different ways of doing this. Here I've got complexity, where the dependencies I've just been talking about are the most complex, but you could actually look at adjacent dependencies and you could look at position. So you can make the problem easier and easier. And so this is the situation that we've been talking about, but you could also make the adjacencies, the dependencies adjacent, and you could begin to look to see if variability actually helps in this case. Now, a really bright undergraduate by the name of Danielle Vignati pointed out to me that this might also tell you something about processing window, because this actually puts learners at a disadvantage, right? Because you've got the irrelevant information at the end of the processing window. So we might be able to get at processing window that way too. Or you could actually look at position. So you could look to see if having high variability actually helps with learning position. And these are the studies we're just starting. We want to also know, for example, whether this kind of ability is domain specific or whether it generalizes to other domains. So we're in the process of setting up a visual paradigm that will help us begin to look at this issue. So would love to get people's feedback on these studies, because we're just now starting them and we haven't decided, for example, whether we're going to present these color patches serially, whether we're going to use patterns or color or what. We're just beginning to think about these studies. But you can imagine putting infants in a situation where they would see these types of stimuli, and you could look to see if they learn the dependencies. And there are all sorts of things we have to consider, like how quickly you present the information, or whether you just present it for a period of time. Did anybody notice what the color dependencies were between the first and third elements? Right, red and yellow, and like gray and turquoise. Yeah. But that would tell us something about whether this is domain specific, whether we can get them to learn these dependencies in another domain. But here's another study we're working on. This is something that Danielle Vignati is working on also. And in fact, she got all these, we spent a few minutes talking about this on Thursday, and she figured out how to put together all of these displays over the course of the weekend. And this is actually a technical problem. These are all generated randomly. Now, the idea is to have a pattern. In this case, it's just pattern A, but we're going to also include X patterns along with these to see whether the invariant structure will pop out for learners as you increase the number of X patterns. And so we have all sorts of issues to think about, like, should you present these quickly? You'll see if you present this quickly, the pattern starts to pop out. Can you see that? It's in the middle. Well, I think this problem will be much more complex if we actually have 4 patterns, for example, or 3 patterns, right? I mean, it's going to be a lot harder to solve this type of thing, but we're hoping that we'll be able to show invariance detection in a visual domain. So we're pretty excited about these studies too. So, implications of an invariance detection mechanism. By the way, I'm actually going to end sooner than I thought, so I just have a few more things to talk about. So implications of an invariance detection mechanism. Well, one thing I think that's interesting about this is that larger learning spaces have traditionally been assumed to present a more difficult problem for the learner, right? I mean, we've got this whole problem of computational complexity. And so the finding that the larger learning spaces are easiest for learners is really counterintuitive. And what seems to be happening is that variability seems to be attuning learners to the non-change in the environment, enabling them to focus on the information of most relevance, right? The only information that's relevant in these grammars has to do with the dependencies, the long-distance dependencies. So I guess one question you might ask is whether this type of mechanism reduces the size of the learning space in some sense. That's actually a question I need to ask Bob Frank, and it's too bad he's not here today. But if you can imagine a learning mechanism that has to process sentence by sentence, if you've got, you know, like a Turing machine or whatever, if you've got a mechanism that can actually reduce these unique strings down to 3 rules, to me it seems like you've got something like reduction of the learning space. Although I must confess I'm not an expert in learnability, so I need to talk to an expert on this. But in any case, invariance detection is yet another ability to consider in those available to learners. And I think it might play a really important role when it comes, for example, to acquiring syntactic categories, because we know syntactic categories, there's a reliable relationship in English anyway, but in other language too, between these functional elements and lexical categories. So in summary, I've asked a number of questions. I've asked, can 12-month-olds acquire complex word order? Can they abstract beyond the specific surface properties of the training stimuli? Can we find evidence of more powerful generalization? What about frequent patterns? So we've investigated these various abilities, and we've found that infants show these sensitivities across a range of different types of problems. Now we have to ask what the implications might be for language learning, okay? Some of you might be thinking, well, what does this have to do with language after all? And in order to do that, I think we need to talk about why grammar learning is a difficult induction problem. So one reason is because we have to explain how we can keep rampant overgeneralization at bay. But in fact, what I think these studies tell us is that learners only generalize when there's sufficient evidence to do so. They're very conservative. They don't learn associations willy-nilly. So there's some evidence to think that this isn't as big a problem as we thought it was. What about the fact that the input is limited and that it's not perfect? Well, in fact, we have some evidence that learners can generalize from limited input, but we need to do some more studies with infants. We need to show, presumably they can do this, right? I mean, that's what kids are doing. They get limited input and they can generalize, but we'd like to know more about the mechanisms involved. We're also asking whether learners can acquire probabilistic grammars. So we're using the Marcus stimuli and we're sampling from the other grammar with some probability. So with some probability, we're inserting ungrammatical strings to see whether these types of distortions can actually set the learner off track. This actually also allows us, I mean, actually the main motivation for doing this is to get at novelty and familiarity preferences, but the beauty of this study is that it's going to be informative no matter what we do. But anyway, this is something that Laura LaCosta is working on. What about complexity? Well, I've talked about the possibility of mechanisms for reducing the complexity or the size of the learning space. But there are problems that we still clearly need to address. So there are properties for which there's no evidence in the input. An example would be, say, structure dependence, where a child is actually misled by the evidence in the input. So you've got a child being able to take a sentence like, the man who is tall is Sam, and they can correctly generate the man, they don't say the man who tall is Sam. If they were just moving words around linearly, they would do that, but they in fact correctly say the man who is tall, or is the man who is tall Sam, okay? So they don't move the first is, they move the second, right? So there are complex problems like this that are logical sorts of puzzles that we clearly are not addressing. So in conclusion, I guess what I'd argue is that learners have been markedly absent in the study of language acquisition. But in fact, humans are remarkable learners. We know that from all of the work that Peter and his students have done, and we know that from the kinds of results we're getting in these artificial language studies. They're remarkable learners. And so I think what we're finding out is that given these learning abilities, we really need to consider learning in our acquisition theories. We need to ask how learning factors into these theories. We can't assume that the learning mechanisms are rudimentary, because they aren't. And so what I hope I've convinced you of is the fact that the empirical problem of language acquisition may not be as daunting as the logical one, or as impossible to prove. So that's it. And by the way, I just want to mention, I mentioned all of my helpers except for Camille Recroy, my lab coordinator, and Lori Powers, another one of our excellent undergrads. So, any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, regarding the learning of the invariants at the beginning and end of sentences, I guess two things. One is, in the experiment with adults, what percentage of the learning, the correct identification corresponded to people who said they had consciously identified the pattern? And second, do you think...
Like what proportion of people do that?
What portion of the correct responses were generated by people who consciously identified the pattern?
They, on average, those people, those were, like if you look at the proportion of people who produce all three rules, it's about 80% of the people do that. Was that your question? Did you want to know what the match is between the rules they report and their actual performance in the other part of the task?
Well, it sounded like you had asked the people after the test if they consciously identified that A goes to D.
No, we didn't lead them. We asked them whether they noticed any patterns. Yeah, and they spontaneously report that they say, oh yeah, we noticed the pattern between the first and last word, and this is what it was. This is the dependency. Yeah. So they're very specific, and we don't lead them.
So there were people who discriminated but didn't say they identified the pattern.
Yeah, there could have been. Yeah, we haven't actually broken it down that way, but yeah, there are.
Because it just seems like that case would correspond more to infants.
Well, we're actually we're looking at implicit learning of this kind of structure, and it turns out we're having a hell of a hard time getting it. You would think that people would be able to do this when they're coloring or finding hidden pictures, but in fact they can't. So far they can't, but we've kept the exposure period to about 20 minutes. We're going to increase it. And we're also getting set up to look at 6- and 7-year-olds to see if they can do it implicitly. It would be really interesting if we found that they did, because so far all of the findings, all of the effects we found are age invariant. So, yeah, what was your second question?
Just that, I mean, if you're talking about long distance dependencies in language, something at the beginning and the end, that dependency seems like it might be easier.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I agree. We need to actually begin to embed these in more complex structure, and we will do that. Yeah, so that's sort of another direction, sort of next up the line, but it still is amazing to me that learning is so dramatically different in that condition of high variability. Right, so if it were that easy, the question is, well, why didn't they all learn the dependency? So, but I agree, those are particularly salient. And we might not get that kind of learning if we actually embedded the dependencies. It might be a lot harder. So, yeah.
Yeah, I had some other questions about the grammars that they, finite grammars that you use. First, if you know about using more complicated grammars,
Yeah. Yeah, we will eventually do those kinds of things, yeah.
About kind of general properties of the sizes of those finite grammars. We thought about how many states or how many connections, what are boundaries.
Right. We actually put limits on the number of states. So we say you can only have so many recursions. So like maybe 2 recursions of a particular element, because some of the elements can loop. And so with the constraints we put on these grammars, they only generate about 20 strings. So they're fairly small. And we expose learners to a subset. So we expose them to half during training, and then we test them on the other 10 at test.
So if you thought about maybe having a bigger, what's the effect of having a bigger grammar? What do you think the effect of having, how much do you think it is for learning?
I'd actually have to think about how you would expand the grammar, because I think if you make the sentences longer, that's actually going to be harder for infants. It's actually hard for adults to learn really long sentences. They learn a lot about the ends of sentences, the beginnings and ends, and a few elements in, but their knowledge about the middle is actually not as good. So we would run into problems like that. Yeah. We actually have been trying to get away from finite state grammars because we don't think that natural language is a finite state grammar, right? So if we were to pursue those types of issues, that might be more from a sort of theoretical, comparing different types of formal languages and that type of thing, maybe, and how people perceive those. So, but what's kind of interesting is that people don't process finite state grammars in the mathematical sense. So those repeating elements pop out for them perceptually. And some people have actually tried to, well, actually, I'm sure this is something people do all the time in other areas. They characterize the complexity of grammars. But it's not clear to me that characterizing the complexity of a finite state grammar maps on very clearly to how people perceive these grammars, because their perception is so different from the mathematical formulation. So
actually, I have one more question, which is, it seems like this is making a pretty strong statement that learning syntax is very separate from learning semantics. Certainly learning those finite grammars is making that argument. Do you think you would carry that argument for language in general, or do you think it's just the fact that the sample you looked at was small?
I think this type of learning might characterize what happens early on, but clearly later on, you're going to have to consider the semantic information, right? I mean, maybe it's naive of me, but I assume that the 4-month-old or the 6-month-old, obviously we're not looking at babies that young. We're looking at babies, for the most part, who actually can, they are processing information syntactically at, probably at 12 months of age, certainly at 18 months of age. But it seems completely, I have no problem with the idea that 6-month-olds, well, actually, I guess we have to consult Ruth and Peter on this, because they've actually shown that 6-month-olds can, they understand the correspondence between the name mommy and a picture of their mommy. So there is some semantic mapping going on. Have you guys found out mapping for words? Are they doing any mapping of common objects at that age? Or
Hands and feet.
Hands and feet, right, yeah. So maybe I have to back up and say, 4-month-olds are not processing semantically. But clearly I would love to try to look at both sources of information, but I'd have to come up with ways to do that, I think. Yeah, Melanie?
This is just a comment on what you said. Just because they're doing semantics and they're doing syntax doesn't mean they're doing a mapping between the two.
Right. Oh, I didn't mean to imply that, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that. All I meant to imply is that there is something going on at the level of meaning, given the kinds of studies that Peter and Ruth have done. So, yeah.
But even, with your notion of talking about invariance, certainly it's another source of information that one could use.
Right.
In these situations where there's a correlation from something
Right.
else that's distinctive. The other thing I was going to raise about the invariance issue is that, in some sense, if you go back and you look at the old work that Jackie Gibson did and compare situations in which people are good at transferring things and where they're not as good as transferring things. So one situation is a situation where you just have experience with the object itself, and you see it, repeatedly on many trials. And the other situation is a situation where you, in fact, have an opportunity to compare more or less side by side to pick out what the distinctive features are. This is what she's always argued on, these sorts of things. And of course, it turns out that people do retain the information better in a situation in which you have a chance to compare. And so there is that, I think there is, if you go back to it, there is that sense in the kinds of things that she talked about, the notion that that more variability is going to be good in this situation because it gives you more situations in which to pick out the distinctive features of objects.
Oh, that's helpful.
You can see what remains constant. And I guess I saw that in particular with your visual dot display there. And that would be exactly the kind of situation in which you're getting information from the environment.
That's really helpful because, in fact, I've been trying to find sort of analogous situations in other domains, and because, it just seems like this is something infants should be able to do, right? it seems like one way of figuring out structure is to notice what doesn't change, right, relative to what does change. So I think it's probably fundamental, both to auditory processing and to visual processing. So we'll be really excited if we could show that. Yeah, Amanda?
So a lot of the studies that you're talking about involve sort of the generalization from word order effects. And I guess I'm sort of wondering how learning would occur in this kind of environment.
Crucial by the age of 12 months if you're learning English, but it may not be if you're learning a language where words can be scrambled. So it might be really interesting to look at, how easily infants of different ages, whether it needs to be sequentially, whether the structure needs to be sequential, or whether you could get similar learning by adding distinctive correlated features that would occur in those other, in those languages that don't have fixed word ordering. And it would be really interesting, much in the way that Janet Worker has approached this, if you could show, and I have no doubt you'd see this, that kids who are exposed to English at some point would lose the ability. I mean, they would become really focused in on order because that's it's a consistent cue for them. So you might actually see developmental effects like she's seen. So. And for those of you who don't know, Janet Worker's done work where she shows that early on infants can distinguish the sound patterns in all languages, but by 8 to 10 months of age, they lose their ability to distinguish sound patterns that are not in their native language. Yeah, Melanie?
I'm not sure if this is maybe just the same way you're saying it. It seems like what you're saying about the usefulness of sort of morphological markers in helping the infant to extract variants might be thought of, when you're looking at these kinds of languages where word order is really complex, where generally it's thought of that the word order is still there, it's just at a much more abstract level, that the higher amount of morphological marking might not be so much in terms of, the more, it per se marking the word as being that, but to actually be an aid to the infant in abstracting something that's more complex and higher level. So there might be a gradation between the different languages in terms of the amount of morphological marking.
Well, so if I understand, maybe you're saying that, maybe you could actually distinguish these learning problems in terms of complexity. And so if you actually look at it as a hierarchical problem, it might actually be more complex. If you have free word order and you have to actually associate morphological markers with particular words. Maybe I don't understand your point.
Well, okay, so languages where the word order looks free
Right.
might simply be more of people have suggested it as just more, a sort of more, there's more structure to it or whatever, that it's a little bit less clear cut, but the structure is still there. And so if we have a harder time assigning the structure, but it's still there, then obviously it's a learning problem.
Mm-hmm.
Too, maybe, and that might be a reason that there's more.
Right, yeah, right.
Slobin and Weber's work suggests that there isn't a consistency in order in languages they looked at, one of which was Turkish. There's a 1981 paper, and the reason I'm sensitive to this is because I raised this kind of issue with Slobin at one point, which reminds me of the work that they had done. Because I had wondered to myself whether even in acquisition, whether or not in those languages with reasonably free word order, whether or not input to the child tends to be more in one form than another. In other words, so that there is some underlying structure there that way. And he claims no.
Do you think it matters if the rules all have the same sort of general rule template? So for example, all the rules are beginning with A, ending with X, or beginning with B and ending with
Right.
Y.
So all the rules are a dependency over one intervening element.
Or do you think they're learning to follow the whole sort of template and then learning to instantiate it?
That would be interesting. I guess I'd have to think about how to test that, but that would really be an interesting thing to pursue. I would probably do that with adults. It's really helpful to pilot these types of studies with adults, but that's an interesting notion. Yeah, it certainly adds a level of abstraction that is relevant, you know, for some of the for issues that are important in language. So that's a really interesting comment. I'll try to think about how I might examine something like that. Yeah. I mean, maybe you could do some kind of transfer study where you had a condition where you had a variety of rules versus, you know, one consistent rule, and you could look to see how people transferred the rules. I mean, I don't know. I'd actually have to think about this.
The reason I just thought of it is because it just occurred to me that you had 4 rules with exactly the same vocabulary, and they all had that same sort of general template, and then 4 rules with the same vocabulary were different. This seems like it's a much harder problem than
Yeah,
the first one, but
right, because actually what they could be learning is sort of a category of type of rule, right? So that's a really interesting observation. I bet that's what happens. Yeah, yeah. Okay, are we ready to go? Thank you.